Yo, what's going on, YouTube? And welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte, and we have to take a look today at your Vancouver Canucks as they had some big moves in the organization this past week. So we'll be going over that today. So Sunday night was the big day for the Canucks, and we already made a video talking about the firing of Jim Benning and Travis Green. But the new regime in Vancouver has already begun. Bruce Boudreau is the new interim head coach for the Vancouver Canucks, and we also have a new general manager for your Canucks. Jim Rutherford, who came over, he is the new bench boss, well, really the head boss of the Vancouver Canucks. So you may be asking, well, what is the history of Jim Rutherford? Because this is a guy, if you know anything really about hockey, you probably know a little bit about Jim Rutherford. Jim Rutherford had a playing career. He was a goalie for the Pittsburgh Penguins for a while. He ended up joining the Carolina Hurricanes as his first management role. He was an interim general manager and the president of hockey operations. That's what it is. So if you see POHO in there, that's what that means, President of Hockey Operations, as well as serving as an interim GM. He did that with the Hartford Whalers, which ended up becoming the Carolina Hurricanes. He was there throughout that entire tenure from 1994 to 2014. So he spent 20 years with the Carolina Hurricanes organization. He had won a Stanley Cup in that time, the 2006 season, where the Carolina Hurricanes won their first and only Stanley Cup. Now, after that, things kind of fell through with the Carolina Hurricanes, and he ends up moving on to the Pittsburgh Penguins, where he becomes the general manager of the Pittsburgh Penguins. He was in Pittsburgh from 2014 up until this year, 2021, and Jim Rutherford had a pretty good history as a general manager in Pittsburgh as well. But he definitely had his downfalls, and that really came more toward the end of his career. So we're going to go over a couple of his trades in his trade history. So you're going back to his earlier seasons in Carolina, some of his more significant trades. He traded Alexei Panakarowski for Joe Sova and a fourth-round pick that ended up becoming Jacob Slavin. That was in 2012 that trade was made. They also made another trade a couple months later that summer where Eric Stahl and Jordan Stahl were at Jordan Stahl's wedding, and he was traded on his wedding day. Jordan Stahl to the Carolina Hurricanes from Pittsburgh. The Pittsburgh Penguins acquired Brian Dumoulin, Brandon Sutter, and what would become the first-round pick of the Hurricanes. That was the 8th overall pick, Derek Pouliot, which is interesting because Pouliot is, at last time I checked, his last NHL stint was with the Vancouver Canucks, so kind of to spin it around. So that was the first trade we saw. We ended up seeing another trade. His first significant trade in Pittsburgh was a trade where he traded James Neal. James Neal's contract to the Nashville Predators. In exchange, he picked up Nick Spaulding and Patrick Hornquist. Now, that was a pretty good trade at the time, and one of the more significant moves he made early on in his career in Pittsburgh. He also made a trade. He traded the 16th overall pick in 2015. That ended up being the Oilers pick. They traded back to the Islanders for Griffin Reinhart. The Islanders, who did they select with that pick? Number 13, Matt Barzal. So, in a weird way, the Pittsburgh Penguins could have gotten Matt Barzal. Just an interesting thought to put in your head there. As well as Rob Klinkhammer, which is he is the best player in this trade, no doubt, right? Yeah, you know I'm kidding about that. Well, Pittsburgh ends up getting David Perron from the Edmonton Oilers, and he played in Pittsburgh for a little while that season, and he was actually a pretty good player. Now, in the summer of 2015, this was a year of development now since Jim Rutherford was in the organization, and he moved out some coaches, and he was able to acquire 2 second-round picks that year. In the summer of 2015, he basically traded Dan Bylsma, who was the head coach of the Pittsburgh Penguins. They traded him to Buffalo for a third-round pick. That didn't end up going so well for the Buffalo Sabres. He was fired, I think, less than 2 years later. Literally within a month or two, John Hines, who was the Wilkes-Barre Penguins head coach, ends up going to the New Jersey Devils for a third-round pick. So the Penguins have picked up 2 third-round picks for coaches that have not really had success with those organizations. And that was kind of interesting with the Devils because that's a divisional rival for the Pittsburgh Penguins. The fact Jim Rutherford let him go, definitely kind of interesting there. Now, here is one of the blockbuster trades, and this is a big one. So this was the Phil Kessel trade that sent Phil Kessel from the Toronto Maple Leafs to the Pittsburgh Penguins. So the Pittsburgh Penguins traded Scott Harrington, who I believe was a former first or second round pick. He was a pretty highly thought of prospect at the time. Nick Spaulding, who they just acquired in that trade for Patrick Hornquist and James Neal. Kasperi Kapanen, a 2016 first round pick that ended up becoming Sam Steele. A 2016 third round pick, which ended up becoming James Greenway. So that was a pretty significant load going to Toronto. Now, what did Pittsburgh get out of this trade? Well, they picked up a couple of contracts, some bigger guys. They picked up Kasper Borgqvist, who was conditional. That was a second-round pick in 2016. Tyler Biggs and Tim Erickson, who were not really good. They were going to be AHL guys, but just to clear out some defensive space for the Maple Leafs, and also Phil Kessel. And the Leafs have retained 15% of that salary on Phil Kessel. So that was probably one of the biggest trades in terms of blockbuster trades we saw in Jim Rutherford's NHL career, his management career so far. He made a couple of other trades. He made a deal in 2015 sending Rob Scuderi to the Blackhawks for Trevor Daley. Trevor Daley ended up doing pretty well the rest of that season with the Penguins. They didn't end up keeping him. He ended up going back to the Dallas Stars, but Trevor Daley had a decent amount of success with the Penguins at that time. Now, the Penguins ended up trading David Perron and Adam Clendening to the Anaheim Ducks for Carl Hagelin. This was the point where Carl Hagelin had, I believe he had been let go in free agency, or he might have been a trade piece for the New York Rangers where Hagelin ended up in Anaheim. He ends up going back to the East Coast to play for the Penguins. Now, this was another pretty big trade here coming up. In 2016, the early part of this, the winter season in 2016 before the deadline. Actually, this was a trade deadline move. Justin Schultz, 50% retained by Edmonton. The Penguins pick up Justin Schultz for a third-round pick. That became Philip Berglund, not really a guy that anybody's really talked about. Justin Schultz became a good cornerstone top four defenseman in the Cup years for the Pittsburgh Penguins. That was a really good trade. Again, a third-round pick for this guy. Now, in 2016, they made another trade. They traded out Bo Bennett for a third-round pick in 2016. Bo Bennett was a former first-round pick of the Pittsburgh Penguins. They kind of lost value there in that deal. They traded a former first-round pick for a third-round pick. Bennett ended up not becoming anything in New Jersey. He ended up not signing another contract in Pittsburgh. And last time I checked, he is playing in Europe at this point. Now we start to see some more trades here. So in 2017, remember that time where the Penguins didn't have enough grit and size, and they needed to add Ryan Reeves for a couple months? Ryan Reeves went to the Pittsburgh Penguins, as well as a second-round pick that became Zach Lazan. He ends up going to Pittsburgh. He ends up becoming a St. Louis draft pick. But the Penguins traded out Oscar Sundqvist and the 31st pick in the 2017 draft, which became Klim Kostin, which is actually a really solid prospect in the organization for the Blues to this day. Now, it's a guy, he's more of a power forward. It takes him a while to develop, but Klim Kostin is still considered a prospect. So the fact they gave up, they got Ryan Reeves and a mid-second round pick guy, St. Louis right now won that trade in that sense. Now, this is another interesting trade. They traded another former first-round pick in Derek Pouliot for Andre Padan and a 2018 fourth-round pick. Now, none of those guys ended up turning into anything, but that is now two former first-round pick selections in Pouliot as well as Bo Bennett that didn't end up working out for the Penguins. Now, this was another trade. We saw a three-team trade here, so this was right before the deadline in 2018. One of the more significant trades that the Vegas Golden Knights had made. So the Ottawa Senators acquire Ian Cole, Philip Gustafson, a 2018 first-round pick that ended up becoming Keandre Miller. So in a sense, this ended up going to the Rangers. A 2019 third-round pick, Anthony Honka, which I believe is the brother of Julius Honka. Haven't really heard much of him. Now, what did the Vegas Golden Knights get? What did the Penguins get in this deal? So Pittsburgh got Derek Brassard. They retained 40% of the salary, did Vegas. Tobias Lindbergh. And then from Ottawa, the Penguins got Vincent Dunn and a 2018 third-round pick, and Justice, who ended up becoming Justice Unare, who nobody knows who that is, so it doesn't really matter. Now, Vegas also got Derek Brassard and Ryan Reeves and a fourth-round pick. So a lot of things going on there. Again, you're looking at the goalie, Philip Gustafsson, a pretty good goaltending prospect right now, if that's who I'm thinking it is, unless it's the other Gustafsson, which he ended up not becoming anything. But if this is the goalie prospect, that's actually pretty good for the Senators, as well as if they kept that first-round pick from Pittsburgh, that would have been Keandre Miller for the Ottawa Senators instead of the Rangers. So interesting to see how that played out. So we end up seeing them trade Carl Hagelin back to the West Coast. Carl Hagelin, in 2018, ends up going to LA for Tanner Pearson. That trade didn't end up working out for really either team. And then a couple weeks later, again, this is the third time the Penguins have traded a first-round selection out of the organization. Daniel Sprong, a very highly regarded prospect, a sniper, a guy that could put the puck in the net. He ends up leaving. But they did pick up Marcus Pettersson, who has been one of the better defensemen on the blue line for the Penguins. Again, that's not saying too much because of the problems the Penguins have had on the blue line, but still, something to be said there. Now we get to 2019. They trade out Brassard, Sheahan, a couple of draft picks. They bring in Nick Bukestad and Jared McCann. Jared McCann has actually turned out to be a good player. They kind of revitalized his career in the top six with Malkin or Crosby. He is now a member of, I believe it's the Toronto Maple Leafs. He was selected in the expansion from the Seattle Kraken. Another trade here where they flip Phil Kessel out. So Phil Kessel and Dan Burks and a fourth-round pick go to Arizona in exchange for Alex Galchenyuk and Pierre-Olivier Joseph. Now, Galchenyuk was a former third overall pick, I believe, in 2014, 2015, around that time. He never really developed into anything, but Pierre-Olivier Joseph, actually a pretty solid defensive prospect for the Penguins, and he's actually been a top 4D man in the organization. Now, there's another trade here where they traded, again, kind of fleecing the Oilers, a 2021 sixth-round pick, which became Shane LaChance, a member of the Edmonton Oilers, for John Marino, who a lot of people throughout most of last season in 2021 maybe had him winning Rookie of the Year. One of the best defensive prospects in the NHL last season for a sixth-round pick. That's a pretty good move there by the general manager, Rutherford. Now, in February of 2020, this was one of the last moves we saw Jim Rutherford make. He makes a deal with Bill Guerin, obviously has that connection when Guerin was a part of the staff, an assistant GM in Pittsburgh with Rutherford. The Penguins acquired Jason Zucker and his $5.5 million cap hit. They flipped Alex Galchenyuk, Kalen Addison, who was a first-round pick of the Pittsburgh Penguins, and a guy that Bill Guerin really liked in his time in Pittsburgh, a 2021 first-round pick. That became Carson Lambos, which he is not. Actually, no, he is with the Minnesota Wild. So that ended up being a pretty good trade for Bill Guerin, and this was one of the deals where we said, all right, maybe Jim Rutherford's losing his mind just a little bit. And then we started to see some other trades here. He trades back for Kasperi Kapanen, as well as a couple of other pieces. They flipped Philip Hallander, a first-round pick, Rodion Amirov. He was a really solid prospect last year for the Leafs as a black ace. And this was pretty much one of the nails in the coffin for Jim Rutherford in September of 2020, trading Patrick Hornquist to the Florida Panthers for Colton Sevier and Michael Matheson, one of the worst contracts in the league, in terms of analytics-wise, one of the worst analytically driven defensemen in the league at that almost $5 million cap hit. This was one of the nails in the coffin for Jim Rutherford. He had brought in Eric Goodbranson. He didn't work out. Bringing a lot of slow blue liners to the point where the Penguins have had to completely rebuild that group. And there is some concern about Jim Rutherford in those regards. He's been a great general manager. He won a cup in 2006 with the Carolina Hurricanes, 2016 and 2017 with Pittsburgh. But some of the trades that he made toward the end of his career in Pittsburgh leaves a lot of people scratching their head wondering what is he doing necessarily? And that is the concern I do have for the Canucks here. This was not one of the guys we heard that was in the conversation for the Canucks job. A lot of younger minds were on, fresher ideas were on the mind. But it seems like the Aquilinis go with a guy, a proven general manager. He knows what he's doing. But there is some cautious optimism with this move. I do have my questions about how thorough the Canucks organization went into hiring him. Is it just a guy that they knew and it comes down to the old boys club and they just knew who he was and that's how it worked? I hope that's not what happened. I hope that's not what we're seeing. But hey, listen, the Canucks, you got your guy. So let's see what they do with that. Guys, that is it for today's video. If you like what we're doing here at Goal Line Hockey, want to see the latest news around the NHL, more videos just like this one, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up and an even bigger subscribe down below. Guys, as always, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you again next time.